Well, Brian was my firstborn son, or firstborn child, my only son, and he sounded like a mother, very proud mother, but he was an exceptional kid. He was just the kindest, best-hearted kid, as well as he was this little mathematical genius, that he was in a talent search for mathematical reasoning was off the chart. But he was also, and I think even more than he ended up later getting a PhD in engineering and being a data scientist. But I think he was probably proudest when he was in elementary school and he was voted the nicest kid in the school. I mean, that's very much like Brian. Born and raised in Tampa, went to school here, undergraduate at Florida State, did his graduate work at Georgia Tech, and then did his PhD work for NASA at Ames Research Center in California. Received his PhD, but really left NASA because he worked in healthcare as a data scientist that wanted to have a big impact in the world and do things for people. And so that's he was living there when, I don't know if you want to get into that now, but he had been out with friends, walked 2 miles home, and about a block from his house, somebody came behind him and fatally shot him, and the case remains unsolved. What happened was, I got that call that nobody wants, and ironically, I was at a friend's baby shower when my daughter called after being contacted by her dad and the police that Brian was gone.
Let's talk about Brian a little bit different. Describe Brian in one word.
Kind, caring. Hard one word. Caring, maybe.
And Brian describes you in one word. What is that word?
Hopefully caring as well, that I worked in healthcare, and that's what they talk about, is that was probably part of his motivation.
And years after this is gone and still unsolved, what one word describes you now?
It changes all the time. I'm not the same person I was. Moms uses that word, survivor. I'm not sure I always feel like that either. I think wounded, that heartbreak never ends, that your heart is broken, but you realize that it's going to keep beating whether you want it to or not, and that you have to figure out a way of living again, of going forward.
The case is still unsolved, and was there any indication as to why this was done?
Well, Brian had no enemies. People really did love him. So the theory is he was walking alone 2 miles. He actually lived in a pretty good neighborhood, but there was some evidence when they pulled cameras that he was being followed by a couple of people. So their working theory was that somebody got tipped off that there was a guy and it was a robbery, and the person came behind, and it was raining, and he was wearing earphones, and put a gun to his head, and when he jerked, that person fired and then fled the scene. They don't know, and the detective is no longer with the department. And there is so many murders out there that there's really nothing being done about the case. But I think that's probably the most likely scenario, is that, it was what they call a robbery gone bad. Not that all robberies aren't bad, but that the gunfire, and if that person never told anybody, we're never gonna know.
Do you think that there might have been someone around that might have seen something?
Well, it was in a neighborhood. There was a wooded area where he was like a block away, and so there was a neighbor who was actually walking somebody out after they had a gathering at their house, heard the gunshot, ran and saw Brian. At that point, he was already gone, and did not see anybody. There was a vehicle of interest that was seen on video speeding away, but they never did anything with it. Now we're 8.5 years out.
By some miracle, the case gets solved and they find out the person that did this.
Mm-hmm.
What is justice?
There is no justice. I mean, it's me, and a lot of people want that, but nothing's gonna bring them back. And I really have come to terms with, it's just another gun in the wrong hands. And it may not have been their intention to murder him, but even if they did, I don't know, going through that whole court process, to me, would be so difficult. And I think the chances of even getting an answer at this point are so slim, as well as, I don't know, I just feel like it would be another sad story, that there's so many guns and there's so much violence and it's so much out there that that person, it's probably, went through a lot of trauma as well and had a gun, and I don't think that the justice system would really make any difference. I do think it's been very, very difficult for me of not knowing the story, because y'all know, if it's an active investigation, the police tell you very, very little. I didn't even know where my son was shot, what part of his head or any of that. Never really even could know the story to start to wrap your head around the fact that your son is murdered.
You use the phrase, another gun in the wrong hands. Do you feel that is our biggest issue with gun violence, that there are people that get their hands on guns who should not? And if that's the case, then how do we fix that?
I definitely think that that's the problem, and that I'm not anti-gun per se, but people that legitimately have guns need to secure their guns. They need to have them locked up. They don't need to leave them in cars where 12, 14-year-olds admittedly are looking through cars and going in glove boxes and finding loaded guns. That there's no background checks outside in a gun show, that there's too many loopholes as far as people that shouldn't have a gun getting a gun, as well as just access. I mean, yes, my son was a homicide, but most gun deaths in this country are due to suicide. And believe me, there's times where you look at a gun and that's so instantaneous. And so I think we have a huge problem as far as access, and yes, and a person in distress or angry or depressed or not being able to see a future is also a gun in the wrong hands. I very much, as far as living without my son, is the hardest thing that I could ever do. And I want other people to be spared that kind of pain. And in order to do this, we need to be responsible as far as keeping guns out of the wrong hands, of securing a gun, of keeping it locked, of not allowing access, to prevent not only in the case that I have of a homicide that didn't need to happen, of a son that was taken away before he could reach adulthood, before he could, do what he needed to do in his career and have children, and me have grandchildren. And but so my way of dealing with that broken heart is trying to have some kind of good come out of this. And the only good that can come out of this is that people, if they're gun owners, that they're responsible about it and keep that secure and locked. If they have a gun, that they don't pick it up in an anger or in an emotional state and have that time. So maybe even securing it from themselves. For our legislature, for realizing that this is not a Second Amendment right. This is not a partisan issue. This is a human issue. In America, I mean, my son was taken in 2016. At that time, I would go on Gun Memorial and light a candle for him every day. So there's about 3,000 candles right now lit for Brian. And at the time in 2016, it was 100 Americans are killed every day with a gun. Then it became 110, and now it's 125. No other civilized country has this kind of problem. And we need to do this for our children. It's the children that break my heart. It's the kids that have grown up with worrying about an armed intruder coming into their elementary school. And that not being the same as in the past when we were worried about, things that didn't happen as far as like air raid shelters or whatever. They know kids who are killed. They grow up with gun violence. They grow up with hearing gunshots and being afraid. And we shouldn't have to be afraid anymore. And it's some simple steps that we can take to do that. That picture, I think, was given to me by actually Brian's best man at his wedding. I think it was taken in Alaska, I'm not quite sure, but it really, to me, symbolizes a lot of who Brian is. He loved being outdoors, he loved hiking and camping, and he just was of life, he loved people, and that's the America that I want. That's the America that I think he symbolizes, and that I try to honor him with the work that I do to turn this around.
And that's my last question or statement. The work that you do, and Brian's looking down on you and seeing that you were pushing for this advocacy and just this turning of the page. And so talk to Brian and tell him how you feel as you go through this, and how you feel about him as you go through all this.
Well, Brian, you'll always be with me. I miss you so much every day. He was always my advisor, not only about computers and all those things that he would kind of look at me and say, sometimes when I ask questions about mathematics, it's kind of complicated, Mom, but even just his insight in terms of other people and so on, and was the kindest person that I've ever known, the most interested in terms of other people. And Brian, I hope you know that this is how I honor you, how I carry on your legacy, is to hopefully, use your story and you as an inspiration, so that doesn't have to happen in our future.